talked about last week. We're into now the study of the Middle Ages, and I'm not going to be, I don't think at least, that I'm going to be going into quite as much detail in this section of our study of church history as I did in the first section covering the church fathers. There's a reason for that, a couple of reasons at least. I spent too much time covering the church fathers, and also I don't know as much about the Middle Ages as maybe I did about the patristic era, even though I don't know much about any of it. But this is a fascinating period in the history of the church, because I hope that you will see, as people who count ourselves, in our church to be very thankful Protestants, those who are Protestants by conviction and not simply by some sort of quirk of our birth or whatnot. In other words, we believe that there's something to the fact that we're not Catholic, right? There is something important about why we're not Catholic, about why we worship in a church such as this. I hope that you'll get a better understanding looking at the Middle Ages and then coming into the Protestant Reformation, which will be our next section of study in a few weeks from now. I hope you'll have a better understanding of what it means to be Protestant and why that's something that, well, first of all, why there is even something known as Protestantism or a Protestant church. And to understand that, you have to understand something about what was happening in the Middle Ages. So the last time we were together, of course, we kind of introduced some of these issues. Why is it called the Middle Ages? You'll remember it's sort of a pejorative term, and it's kind of hard to get away from. Sometimes people call it the Dark Ages, as though this were a time when there was no cultural advancement. That's really not the case. That's definitely a misnomer. But even the term medieval, which means middle period or Middle Ages, is kind of a way of denigrating this time period, because when it was originally named the Middle Ages in the time of the Renaissance, it was considered to be sort of this parenthesis between the glories of antiquity, the ancient Greco-Roman world, and what was considered to be the rebirth, the Renaissance of those glorious days of old in the 15th century. But be that as it may, this was not a time of, this was not a backwards time, if we can put it that way. There was a lot that happened during the Middle Ages, and it's vital that we understand it if we want to understand the progress of church history. Of course, we've talked about, Christ is the one who founded the church. In Matthew 16, Jesus says, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." And gates, as you'll recall, gates are defensive structures, right? So to say that the gates of Hades or the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, what does that mean? It's not that, the church will overcome this frontal assault by the forces of hell. It's that hell itself will not be able to stop the advance of the gospel. The gates, the walls of death, of evil, of the powers of the devil, the powers of this age, will not be able to halt the spread of the gospel. And so the story of church history is just that, the story of the advance of the gospel. So the last thing we considered, which was point number 2 in our outline, I didn't give it to you tonight. You may have that from last week. We talked about the rise of Islam and looked at a little bit about that. That is important for the history of the church, the rise of this new religious movement known as Islam. Islam is a medieval religious movement. It began in the early Middle Ages and spread far and wide very rapidly in the century after Muhammad's death, and was even spreading into Western Europe, had crossed into the Iberian Peninsula, into modern-day Spain, had even crossed into Frankish territory, just think modern-day France, until the expansion of the Muslim armies was stopped at the Battle of Tours in 732 by a man named Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, okay? And if that had not happened in the providence of God, if that battle had not been won by the Franks, by the Europeans, the history of the world would have been quite different, because it seemed as though really nothing could stop this Muslim horde as it advanced out of the Middle East, across northern Africa, and then coming up and beginning its incursion into Christian Europe, okay? So that's where we ended. Well, I wanted to give you just a little bit more information on the missionary expansion of the church into Europe, because now we're really going to be focusing a lot of our attention on Western Europe. We don't have time to talk about global church history. It would just take us too long. So we're kind of looking at what I think is maybe most relevant to us, to where we come from, to our heritage. And so we'll be focusing a lot on Europe and on Christianity in Europe. Well, let's talk a little bit about Ireland and the British Isles. Christianity reached Ireland in the mid-5th century, so the 400s, under the ministry of Patrick. Now, how many of you here have heard of St. Patrick? Just raise your hand, everybody. If you've heard of St. Patrick's Day, you've heard of St. Patrick, okay? So the patron saint of Ireland, very influential in the conversion of Ireland. Now, Celtic Christianity exercised much influence, you'll see this here, in the northern British Isles. So the Celts, that's the people group that would have inhabited this region, that spoke certain languages. Again, a lot of history, a lot of background there. But there were sort of two types of Christianity that were vying for dominance in the British Isles. So you have this, even though Patrick is coming as kind of an outsider into Ireland, he's coming, having learned Christianity elsewhere is what I mean. He's coming into Ireland. You know, that form of Christianity, as it developed Ireland and the northern British Isles, Scotland and so forth, was somewhat different from Roman Christianity that we've been talking about. It had kind of different emphases. I mean, even the way they cut their hair, the monks, was somewhat different. There were a lot of similarities, but just so you know, there were kind of two groups of Christians, if you will, vying for control. So Celtic Christianity did exercise much influence in the northern British Isles. Roman Christianity was dominant in the south after Gregory I commissioned the monk Augustine to evangelize the Anglo-Saxons in southern England. So you guys remember we talked about Gregory I. Gregory I was a transitional figure. And does anybody remember, what has Gregory I been called? He's the Bishop of Rome, the first pope, essentially, okay? So there's this story that's related by the Venerable Bede that Gregory comes into contact with some children who are being sold in Rome on the slave block. And he is impressed, he's struck by their appearance, their blonde hair and their blue eyes. And he inquires, where are these slaves from? And he's told, well, sir, they're Angles. And according to this legend, he said, well, they're not Angles, they're angels. And so immediately he commissioned a monk by the name of Augustine. This is not Augustine of Hippo, this that we talked about a little while ago, the greatest of the church fathers. This is a different Augustine. He sent Augustine to evangelize Britain. And so because of him, this Roman style of Christianity exercised a great deal of influence in southern England. Well, eventually Roman Christianity won the day over its Celtic counterpart for the control of Britain. So if you watch a movie like Braveheart and you see some of the religious things that are in that movie, right? It's Roman Catholic. If you know anything about the history of If you know anything about the history of England, you'll know that, eventually England became Protestant, but it was under the sway of the Roman Catholic Church. And this is all because, until Henry VIII, this is all because of what happened in these early years, beginning around the 400s, when Gregory commissioned Augustine to evangelize the Anglo-Saxon people. And so, again, if you know anything about the history of England, you'll know they're Catholic, and they're Catholic from early on until a man decides he really needs to divorce his wife so that he can marry somebody that will give him a male heir, and thus is the story of Henry VIII and the birth of the Church of England. Even though Henry had been given a title by the Pope that is still in use today by the King of England or the Queen of England, the Defender of the Faith. You remember that? Now, there was a whole stink about this several years ago because Charles, who's currently the King of England, said that he would not be called Defender of the Faith, but Defender of Faith. I don't know if you guys ever heard about that, and apparently he didn't follow up on that. He accepted the title. Well, where does that title come from? Well, it comes from the Reformation. Before Henry broke ties with the Roman Church, which again goes all the way back to this period in British history, before he broke ties with the Roman Church, he wrote a polemic against Martin Luther. Now, whether he or not he actually wrote it is up for discussion and debate, but there was a work published under his name railing against the errors of this Protestant heretic named Martin Luther. And the Pope was so impressed by the labors of the King of England that he bestowed on him the title Defender of the Faith. So now you know, that literally originally meant Defender of the Roman Catholic faith, even though the Protestant monarch of England still retains that title to this very day. All right. Well, continuing on, Boniface, who lived roughly 675 to 754, was instrumental in the establishment of the German church and bringing the Germans, the Germanic people, into the Roman fold. Belgium and Holland were evangelized by a man named Willibrord, who lived from roughly 658 to 739. And then finally, just again in this 55,000-foot overview, Italy was divided between the Orthodox faith. The peninsula was divided between the Orthodox faith in Rome, and there was also an Arian branch of Christianity, quote-unquote Christianity, if we can put it that way, of the Lombards in southern Italy. So northern Italy was obviously Roman in its sentiments and its religious ideas, but you had this Arian group in the south. Now, let's see who can remember way back when. What is Arianism? We did talk about this. Yes. Very close. Excellent. You are just about there. Arianism is the view that Jesus Christ, the Son, is a creature. So he's a divine figure, but he's not as much God as God the Father is God. He's not as divine as God the Father. He is a created being. And so the church dealt with this heresy at the Council of Nicaea initially in 325. Remember, Constantine has just been converted, so to speak, to Christianity. Arianism is spreading like wildfire. It starts in Alexandria with this priest named Arius who goes against his bishop named Alexander, but it spreads far and wide and it threatens the unity of the church, and Constantine doesn't want anything to threaten the unity of his empire, because if you have a split in the church, you have a split in the empire. So he convenes a council of Christian bishops in 325. It didn't quite solve the problem. It wouldn't be until 381 at the Council of Constantinople that Arianism was sort of put to bed for the most part, but there were still Arian groups here and there. And so you see that in Italy. This was resolved in Rome's favor by the year 675. So in the 7th century, late 7th century, you do have now Roman Christianity as the dominant form of the faith in Italy. Any question about all of that? Yes.
There's any writings about the liturgy of times because you had Bible, right?
Well, they had the Bible, but it wasn't, not everybody had the Bible.
Talk about how they together to serve the Lord. And
Yes.
they are like the apostle having the together.
Yeah, that's a good question. And he's asking essentially what information is there about how a church service might operate. And, there is much there that we can glean. I'm not sure that I could give you a lot of information, but at this point, you have the developments of things that we know today as the Mass and things like that. So yes, there's still, there's Christian artwork. Christians are relying in different parts of the empire. And there will be controversies over this, whether artwork should be allowed in church, whether people should be able to venerate artwork and statues and things like that. And there's still the reading of the scriptures and singing and things like that. As far as I'm sure it varied across the Mediterranean world what a typical church service might look like. So I really couldn't, I don't know if I could answer that question fully, but it's a good question. So, yes. Yes. Well, it's influenced by, so for example, one of the great emphases of Celtic Christianity is this focus upon nature. And so, in terms of that focus upon nature, I want to be careful. I don't want to just say that they were out and out pagans, but some of that focus on nature had to have arisen, the beauties of nature and things like this, had to have arisen from the fact that many of these people are being converted out of animistic type pagan religion where nature is worshipped. I'm not saying they necessarily brought all that over, but it's just the fact that Christianity is being planted by Patrick and others. People are coming to the faith, these Celts, and so they have their own, they're learning the gospel, they're hearing the gospel, but they're developing sort of outside of this fold in Italy, this movement in Italy that is beginning to spread, right? So that's why you're seeing different emphases. It's not a different faith. It's not even as, from my reading, which is limited in this area, the differences are not even as drastic as what you're going to see in the time of the Reformation. It's just there are certain emphases that aren't shared. And so, like I said, one of the major emphases of Celtic Christianity is a focus on nature. And so once Augustine begins evangelizing the Anglo-Saxons in the South, it eventually is going to bubble up, right? There's going to be controversy because you have Christians in the northern part of the country who aren't connected to the Bishop of Rome, and because the influence of the Bishop of Rome is spreading so quickly, there's going to be an inevitably conflict between these two branches. And so there's a long, complicated history, but eventually that is worked out, and it's worked out in Rome's favor. Does that at all answer your question? So Patrick is associated with the rise of Celtic Christianity in Ireland, but there are other sources, and I would just refer you to good history books to get more of that. At this point, I just want you to kind of see that there were two traditions of Christianity that were developing in the British Isles, and eventually it won out in the year Oh goodness! It eventually won out in favor of the Roman version of Christianity. And so, if you want more on that, I would encourage look at you could find it easily as far as the detailed history of that. So, good question. Good question. Yes. That's fine. Say that one more time.
So the political element of
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. So the success of Roman-style Christianity, once you get to this period in church history, even back in I don't know that we're gonna make it there tonight, but we are hopefully getting soon, because I want you guys to understand, if you've ever heard the terms, and you have, Roman Catholic, but if you've ever heard the term Eastern Orthodox, I want you to know where that came from, and we're gonna talk about that a little bit, because you hear a lot. For example, in the last few years, a very prominent evangelical voice that was on radios across the country converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, right? The Bible Answer Man, Hank Hanegraaff. And so we'll talk about what even is Eastern Orthodoxy. But already back in the patristic era, the era of the fathers, you have this, a very serious distinction between Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity. So Eastern Christianity, you've got Antioch in Syria, you've got Jerusalem, you've got Alexandria is going to be the major center of Eastern Christianity until Constantine moves his capital to Byzantium and establishes Constantinople. Well, you've also got Western Christianity, and Western Christianity is in many respects centered in Rome. Because the Roman bishop is beginning to claim a primacy for himself. And so, going all the way back to the time of Constantine, when a legend arose that Constantine was sick and was miraculously healed by the Roman bishop, and as a result, bequeathed lands and power to Rome, the Roman bishop. And so Romans looked to that. It was a work that was written called The Donation of Constantine. This was, Roman bishops would point to this and say, see, Constantine gave us our power. But Rome was an incredibly important city, not just politically, obviously as the center of the empire, but for Christians. Rome, for many Christians in the West, it became sort of the hub of this wheel of Christianity. And there's a lot of reason for that. Paul was martyred there. Peter was supposedly martyred there. The bones of the apostles lie in rest there. And so from very early on, you have a powerful movement centered in Rome that just cannot be stopped. Now, beyond that, I would just refer you to some good historians as to what's going on there. But it is the fact that, Rome is the center of the world. Rome is the great city, and that can't be overlooked. And you couple that with Rome as the place where Peter is martyred, where Peter was bishop, supposedly, and then you bring in an interpretation of Matthew 16, where it's thought that Jesus gives to Peter a primacy over all the other apostles. You've got that's a potent mix, shall we say. Mark, would you like to add anything to that?
Did y'all ever, when you were up in Liverpool, study Verdun's books, Anatomy of a Hybrid, Formers and Their Step, those names? I know John Reisinger was passing some of those out. Verdun was a Christian
Yeah, Christian Reform.
And which was strange because he was writing these books basically against his own denomination. The hybrid that he talked about was the relationship of church and state.
Yes.
That about the political power being evil is all pre-Constantinian, you see.
Right.
After Constantine, that's the big change, that now we want the power of the state, the sword, behind the church. And so from that point on, you have this crazy, I mean, you think about when the New World was discovered, the Spanish conquistador came ashore and planted the flag of the country of Spain, the King of Spain, and right behind him was the Padre who claimed it for the Catholic Church.
Right.
So evangelism became political
Yeah.
in nature.
Yeah.
If we can politically take power over a particular area, then we have Christianized it.
Yes.
So you can imagine it's a very strange system to our way. We come from a very different background.
Right.
And it's very hard for us to grasp that.
So yes, the political power of Rome, the political prestige of Rome plays a role in that without a doubt. But even in the 400s, after Rome is sacked by the Visigoths, you remember this, we talked about this with relation to Augustine, because this gives rise to Augustine's greatest theological work, the City of God, because the pagans, and there still are pagans around, are saying Rome got sacked by the barbarians because we stopped worshiping the gods. We turned to this Christian God, and the gods became angry at us and sacked the city. And so it's because, in part because of that, that Augustine writes this book. But even after you see sort of the decline, and absolutely the political power cannot be gainsaid, but even after Rome has been sacked, I mean, it's still exercising that power, because again, you put all that religious, political stuff in the pot and stir it up, you got a potent mix. And so Rome becomes not just the center of the political world, but of the religious world as well. Yes. Uh-huh. Without a doubt. So it's not until you get to, oh goodness, my Baptist history is, I mean, look, it's not until you get to the Anabaptists and on the continent and the Baptist in England that you begin to get Christians who are saying things like the state and the church should not be so closely wed. So with the conversion of Constantine, you have the arrival of this concept known as what Mark was just saying, Christendom, the union of church and state. Now, it wasn't a perfect union. We're going to talk about this in just a second, because there still was a battle over who gets the supremacy, the Pope or the Emperor, right? But it's not until the rise of the Anabaptists and the Baptists that you begin to get Christians who are rethinking this whole relationship between church and state. So absolutely, even when they're called the magisterial reformers, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli are called the magisterial reformers because they believed that it was in part the responsibility of the state to implement these Protestant ideas in their lands. So they weren't averse to using the power of the state to accomplish religious ends, and all this goes back to what we're talking about right now. So, yes. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. James White, who many of you may know, has had a great impact in my life and great ministry, apologetics ministry. Several years ago, before COVID, he took a group to Germany to do kind of a Reformation tour. And I don't remember where it was that they were, but right after, they were in Germany, but I don't remember exactly where. But he takes them, they're talking about Luther, they're at Wittenberg, they're at the Castle Church in Wittenberg, and they're talking about the great reforms that Luther brings in, but then they have to also talk about the fact that, hey, there are some guys that look a lot like us. Not exactly. They're Anabaptists, and I do think there's a difference between an Anabaptist and a Baptist. More on that later. that are being imprisoned for what you and I would consider to be sound, and Luther's all for this. And so, we have to understand that, that's also going on because, and again, they're not averse to using the power of the state to carry out their ends. And so we'll talk about Calvin, we'll talk about Michael Servetus, who was executed by being burned at the stake because he denied the doctrine of the Trinity. And even though Calvin wasn't in favor of him being burned at the stake, he wanted a more humane death. He still thought the government of Geneva should kill him because he was a heretic. And the government is supposed to kill heretics and to keep their ideas from spreading. So very quickly, let's cover number 4, Charlemagne and the rise of the Holy Roman Empire. Holy Roman Empire. Voltaire said that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But nonetheless, we have to reckon with this emergence, the emergence of this reality known as the Holy Roman Empire. So this goes back to what Wayne said. We have a French king named Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, who is crowned Emperor of the Romans. He's nowhere near Rome. Well, he was crowned in Rome, but the guy's European from a different place, and yet they still want the gravitas of a Roman emperor, okay? Just because of the impact, the cultural, political impact of the city of Rome. So Charlemagne means Charles the Great, lived from 742 to 814, became leader of the Franks. Think modern France. It's not exactly the same as modern France, but for the most part, modern France in 768. Now in 800, the year 800, he was crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope. Charlemagne was one of the great rulers of Western civilization. It is impossible, I think, just about impossible, to overstate the impact of Charlemagne. I mean, this is truly one of the great political figures, one of the great figures, period, in all of Western history, Western civilization, world history. A very influential person. He ruled a vast empire that covered modern-day France as well as much of Germany and Italy. According to his friend and also his advisor, a man named Einhard, this is what Einhard had to say about Charlemagne. Charlemagne was large and strong and of a lofty stature, though not disproportionately tall. His height is well known to have been 7 times the length of his foot. So sometimes you may read that Charlemagne was 7 feet tall. That's actually not what Einhard said. He said 7 times the length of his foot. So more on that in a second. The upper part of his head was round. His eyes were very large and animated, nose a little long, hair fair, and face laughing and merry. Thus his appearance was always stately and dignified, whether he was standing or sitting. Although his neck was thick and somewhat short, and his belly rather prominent. Hey, this is me. but the symmetry of the rest of his body concealed these defects. Okay, it's not me. His gait was firm, his whole carriage manly, his voice clear, but not so strong as his size led one to expect. So in other words, this is an imposing figure, but not somebody that would necessarily mow you down, right? I mean, he's presented as somebody that's strong, manly, but not too necessarily aggressive or off-putting. In other words, he's described as almost the perfect kind of man. Now, according to recent estimates, the issue of how tall this man was has occupied the thinking of many a scholar. So recently, some researchers were allowed access to his left tibia because his remains are actually kept at a certain location in Aachen. So according to recent estimates, based on an examination of Charlemagne's left tibia, he stood somewhere between 5'10" and 6'4", which was imposing because the average male height of the day was about 5 feet 6 inches tall. And he weighed in, again, just judging by this one bone, weighed in at about 172 pounds. So maybe Einhard didn't get everything exactly right, but you can see perhaps why such a person would have had such a great influence? Because he is tall. Now, if anybody can remember way back when we were talking about the beginning of the Israelite monarchy, what was that great trait about the first king of Israel that is noted for us? He was tall. He was a head taller than everybody else around, right? And when Samuel goes to the home of Jesse, and Jesse lines up all of his sons, right? I mean, the oldest was tall, right? Manly. This is virility, okay? This is a quality of good leadership, right? Well, we see that even into the Middle Ages, even into our own day, right? These kinds of things matter to people. And obviously the whole point of the David story was he wasn't that tall. He wasn't necessarily that manly looking, but God saw his heart. Man looks on the outward appearance, but God judges the heart. Well, this was there was something about Charlemagne's stature, apparently, that led to his political success. But he was a shrewd ruler. He was wise, and his successors just simply could not fill his shoes, apparently quite literally. And so Charlemagne's empire began to crumble after his death. But I do want you to note this. Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in 800. Why might this be a significant factor for us to consider? Crowned Emperor of the Romans, so they're wanting a revived Roman Empire. They're wanting to carry over the glories, the ideals of the Roman Empire, even into Western Europe. But who makes him Emperor of the Romans? Does he make himself Emperor of the Romans? No. The Pope makes him Emperor of the Romans. So this is kind of the start, not of Christendom. We've seen the union of church and state since really Constantine, even though it was Theodosius who made Christianity the official religion of Rome. But now you have this question bubbling up. Who has the most power? Okay, we're allied here, okay? The secular power, the authority of the state, the church, we're in this thing together. But who really runs the show? Well, the Pope crowned Charlemagne. So if the Pope makes kings, then that must mean the Pope has the power. And so this is going to be a difficult issue in the politics, in the church of the Middle Ages. Who really runs the show? All right? So Charlemagne's successors did lack his leadership skills. The idea of a revived Roman Empire in the West languished after Charlemagne until 962, when a German ruler, Otto, was crowned emperor by Pope John XII. So we have a Frankish ruler who is the first emperor, and then it transfers to a German ruler named Otto. When we get into the time of the Reformation, we're going to find that not only did Martin Luther, when he began his reforming work, when he rediscovered the gospel of grace, not only did he run right into the influence of the Pope, but there was also another figure that he had to deal with. Now, he wasn't a German, he was a Spaniard, and he was the Roman emperor of the day. And so Luther had to contend not just with the Pope, but with the Holy Roman Emperor himself. And Mark, for some reason, his name absolutely escapes me. Charles? Yes. So Charles V. And it would later be the case that when a certain English king by the name of Henry, the 8th Henry, to sit upon the throne of England, needed an annulment of his marriage because his wife, Catherine of Aragon, did not produce a male heir. Well, there was a problem because Catherine of Aragon was related to this guy named Charles V, the King of Spain, who was also the Holy Roman Emperor. So the Pope at that time sort of needed to stay in the good graces of said Holy Roman Emperor, and essentially declaring that the marriage of Henry and Catherine was null and void. Well, he's essentially proclaiming to the entire world that Catherine is a woman of ill repute, and that would not go over so well with the most powerful political figure on the continent, all right? So politics plays a massive role in all of this, okay? So the Holy Roman Empire, you may think, why are we studying this? Because we're going to see it again. And oh, by the way, what did Adolf Hitler call his government? The Third Reich. What was the First Reich, according to Hitler and those who thought like him? The Holy Roman Empire. The Second Reich was the German Empire that came to an end after World War I. And so Hitler saw himself in this line of succession going all the way back to the Holy Roman Empire. And so, why is he doing the things that he's doing? Because he's trying to restore the glories, supposedly, of this Holy Roman Empire, of the German Empire, of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and so forth, okay? So the Holy Roman Empire has a lot of relevance, and I just want you to know a little bit about where it came from, but yes, ultimately Voltaire is correct. It was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, all right? That was just a convenient title. Any questions before we depart? Yes? Essentially Christmas Day 800, when the king of the Franks was crowned emperor of the Romans, Charlemagne. Yeah, I mean, it goes all the way until, I should have written that down. Let's see here. Yeah, so it goes all the way. It is formally dissolved in 1806. The Holy Roman Empire, yes. Yeah, and again, is it an empire? Not really. I mean, you have a figurehead of Europe, in essence. So it's Charles V during the Reformation. But you see, Charles V is elected by other princes. And Luther's prince, Frederick the Wise, is the reason Luther never was attached to a stake and lit on fire. Because Frederick didn't like the Pope interfering in German affairs, and he didn't want to turn his prized monk over to the emperor either. And so it's a figurehead. It's still a powerful figure, but I mean, it's definitely not what we think of as the Roman Empire. I mean, it is nation states that kind of make up a loose organization with a figurehead. Is that fair, Mark? I think.
There's a famous painting in the Louvre of Napoleon crowning himself.
Yes.
The Holy Roman Emperor.
Yes.
That's the end of the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Because now it's not the Pope.
Right.
Making the king. So Napoleon sort of brought the whole thing to the halt.
Got it. See, I'm not as up on the history as Brother Mark is, so I appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah, so.
Well, I just remember a few little
Odds and ends, but no, it's good. I'm glad. I'm glad we got you here. Okay, any other questions? Yes. Oh, we're coming. This is all pre-crusade. Yeah, we're coming. It's bearing down upon us. Yes, we've got the next thing we're going to cover is the Great Schism and the creation of this rift, this final rift between Eastern Christianity. Again, going back to our question from last week, still very much a sociological type term, Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity. And but even with the split, we're going to have the Easterners coming to the Westerners saying, we need help with these Muslims who are at our doorstep and who have taken Christian lands in the Middle East. So even though there's going to be a split, they're going to still ask the Western Christians to come to their aid to defeat the Muslims. So yeah, we're coming. It is bearing down upon us. Good question. Anything else? Let me pray for us and we'll be dismissed. Father in heaven, thank you so much for your grace, your mercy, and your kindness. Thank you for, Father, the fact that indeed you have and are building your church, and we are the recipients of that. This is our history. Sometimes it's sordid, sometimes it's difficult, but Father, we're grateful for when we see the light, as we see it so often in the study of the history of Christianity from its beginnings until now. And we know, Lord, that you will continue to build your church until the day that Christ returns. May we be faithful to his great commission.